Hey there, history lovers, and welcome back to another deep dive into the beautifully brutal world of ancient civilizations. Tonight, we're trading Roman sandals for Peruvian sand dunes as we explore the Moche, a civilization so sophisticated they made pottery that could probably win modern art competitions, and so practical they turned one of the world's harshest deserts into a thriving kingdom that lasted longer than the United States has even existed. Before we begin our journey to the coastal valleys of ancient Peru, go ahead and hit that like button if you enjoyed our previous Roman adventure, and subscribe if you want more stories about people who accomplished impossible things with nothing but human ingenuity and an alarming amount of determination. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from, whether you're in your bedroom at 2 a.m. questioning your sleep schedule, commuting to work and wondering how ancient people managed without coffee, or wherever this finds you in your corner of the world. Now, get comfortable. Maybe grab a warm drink, dim those lights, and prepare yourself for a tale that makes Roman military discipline look like a casual hobby club. Because tonight, we're exploring a civilization that looked at a desert coast where it rains about as often as you get a parking spot right in front of the store, and decided, you know what? This seems like the perfect place to build massive pyramids, create the world's most expressive pottery, and sustain hundreds of thousands of people for over 6 centuries. So settle in as we journey back 1500 years to meet the Moche, the desert kingdom that proves human beings can accomplish absolutely anything when they combine practical genius with artistic vision and just the right amount of collective stubbornness to make the impossible look easy. Before you could even dream of ascending the Great Pyramid to commune with the gods, you had to survive being born into the most beautifully bizarre civilization the world had ever seen. Welcome to the Moche Kingdom, where art was religion, pottery told stories better than Netflix, and your social status was determined by how many feathers you could legally wear without getting executed for impersonating nobility. Let's start with the basics. You're living somewhere between 100 and 700 CE on the northern coast of what would eventually become Peru, though nobody's calling it that yet, because the Spanish won't show up to ruin everyone's day for another 8 centuries. The Pacific Ocean crashes against desert valleys that shouldn't support life, but somehow do, thanks to an irrigation system so sophisticated would make a Roman aqueduct engineer weep with professional envy. Your world revolves around 2 massive pyramid complexes that dominate the landscape like ancient skyscrapers built by gods with a serious authority complex. The Huacas del Sol y de la Luna, the temples of the sun and moon, aren't just religious centers. They're the equivalent of combining the Pentagon, Vatican City, Hollywood, and Wall Street into 2 adobe monuments that can be seen from orbit, if orbit had existed back then and wasn't just where the condors hung out. The Huaca del Sol, the larger of the 2, contains over 130 million adobe bricks. Not clay bricks, not stone blocks, adobe bricks, each one made by hand, dried in the desert sun, and hauled up a pyramid that reaches 160 feet into the sky. Do the math on the human labor required, then remember that they didn't have wheels, pulleys, or labor unions. They had human backs, determination, and probably the world's first occupational therapy program, though it was less about healing and more about sacrificing the workers who complained too much. Living in Moche society meant understanding that everything, and I mean everything, was connected to the supernatural. Your pottery wasn't just functional, it was a religious statement. Your clothes weren't fashion, they were spiritual armor. Even your sex life was regulated by cosmic forces, which sounds romantic until you realize it meant your fertility was considered a community resource managed by priests who took their job very, very seriously. The social hierarchy was more rigid than a Roman centurion's posture during inspection. At the top sat the priest kings, individuals so holy they probably weren't allowed to touch the ground without purification rituals. These weren't elected officials. They were living gods chosen by bloodline, divine vision, or their impressive ability to predict when the rivers would flood. Below them cascaded a pyramid of priests, warriors, artisans, farmers, and at the very bottom, the people who cleaned up after the llamas, which was apparently someone's full-time job. Your clothing told everyone exactly where you belonged in this cosmic pecking order. commoners wore simple cotton tunics in natural colors, the ancient equivalent of wearing a name tag that said, "Hello, I'm nobody important." Warriors got to sport feathered headdresses and gold ornaments, basically walking advertisements that they were professionally dangerous and divinely sponsored. The elite wrapped themselves in textiles so fine they required microscopic examination to appreciate, decorated with images so complex they served as walking religious murals. But the real status symbol was gold. Not just wearing it, but being buried with enough of it to fund a small army. Moche metallurgy was so advanced they could create alloys that wouldn't be duplicated for centuries. They hammered gold into sheets thinner than paper, crafted silver into sculptures that captured light like liquid mercury, and produced copper ornaments in quantities that suggested they basically cornered the ancient metal market. The pottery, though, that's where the Moche really showed off. Forget everything you think you know about ancient ceramics. These weren't utilitarian pots for storing grain. These were narrative masterpieces, three-dimensional novels fired in clay. Portrait vessels so realistic they captured individual facial expressions, complete with dental work, scars, and what can only be described as ancient Peruvian sass. Warriors glared from ceramic faces. Priests smiled with the confidence of men who spoke directly to gods, and commoners looked appropriately terrified of everything. The erotic pottery deserves its own museum wing. The Moche approached human sexuality with an artistic frankness that would make modern curators blush and ancient Romans take notes. Every conceivable romantic configuration was immortalized in clay, not as pornography, but as religious instruction. Fertility wasn't just biological, it was cosmic responsibility. The gods demanded that humans understand their reproductive duties in explicit, ceramic detail. Daily life revolved around agriculture that bordered on miraculous. The coastal desert received maybe 2 inches of rain per year, basically enough moisture to support a determined cactus and nothing else. But the Moche looked at this wasteland and decided to build a civilization anyway. They engineered canal systems that redirected mountain rivers across hundreds of miles, created raised field systems that maximized water efficiency, and developed crop rotation techniques that maintained soil fertility for centuries. The farmers weren't just growing food, they were performing religious obligations. Every seed planted was a prayer, every harvest a divine gift that required proper gratitude. The agricultural calendar was synchronized with religious festivals, astronomical observations, and the complex social obligations that kept Moche society functioning like a precision timepiece made of adobe and devotion. Your typical Moche farmer woke before dawn, not because he wanted to, but because the irrigation schedule was more rigid than military discipline. Water rights were allocated with mathematical precision, and missing your irrigation window meant explaining to your neighbors why your crops were dying while theirs flourished. This wasn't just social pressure, it was survival economics in a desert where agricultural failure meant starvation. The tools were ingenious in their simplicity. Digging sticks hardened in fire, ceramic hoes that could break desert hardpan, and irrigation channels lined with carefully fitted stones. No iron, no steel, just human intelligence applied to hostile geography with results that sustained populations larger than most medieval European cities. But farming was just the foundation. The Moche economy was built on specialization that would impress a modern business school. Potters didn't just make pottery, they were divided into dozens of subspecialties. Portrait artists, storage vessel craftsmen, ceremonial wear specialists, and the elite few who created the masterpieces reserved for royal burials. Each group guarded their techniques with professional jealousy that occasionally erupted into conflicts requiring judicial intervention. Metalworkers operated in a world of trade secrets and religious obligations. Working gold wasn't just craftsmanship, it was communicating with divine forces that lived in precious metals. The workshops were sacred spaces where artisans underwent purification rituals before touching materials that belonged to the gods. Apprenticeships lasted decades, not just to master the technical skills, but to prove spiritual worthiness. The textile workers created fabrics so complex they required teams of specialists working in coordination. Cotton cultivation, fiber preparation, dyeing, spinning, weaving, and final decoration were separate crafts practiced by different social classes. The finest textiles took months to complete, and were considered too valuable for daily wear. They were stored like treasure, displayed during festivals, and eventually buried with their owners as spiritual passport to the afterlife. Trade networks stretched from the Amazon rainforest to the high Andes, an ancient globalization system based on llama caravans and professional diplomacy. Coastal Moche communities exchanged their pottery, textiles, and metalwork for jungle products, mountain minerals, and exotic materials that demonstrated their connection to distant realms. These weren't casual commercial relationships, they were political alliances sealed with intermarriage, religious exchanges, and mutual defense agreements. The warriors who protected these trade routes were professionals in every sense of the word. Training began in childhood with wooden weapons and gradually progressed to bronze, headed clubs, atlals for launching spears, and shields decorated with religious symbols that provided spiritual as well as physical protection. Combat was ritualized, following rules that distinguished between warfare and murder, conquest and genocide. Military campaigns were seasonal affairs planned around agricultural cycles and religious calendars. You didn't just attack your neighbors because you felt like it. You waited for divine approval, gathered proper ritual equipment, and conducted ceremonies that transformed ordinary violence into sacred duty. Captives weren't simply prisoners. They were religious resources whose treatment was governed by complex protocols that balanced practical military needs with spiritual obligations. The priests who managed these spiritual requirements weren't otherworldly mystics. They were practical administrators who understood that religion was the operating system that kept Moche society functional. They maintained astronomical observations that predicted agricultural seasons, managed ritual calendars that coordinated community activities, and supervised the ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchy and cultural identity. Religious architecture reflected this practical spirituality. Temples weren't just places of worship, they were community centers, storage facilities, administrative headquarters, and performance venues all rolled into massive adobe constructions. The murals that decorated these buildings weren't decorative art. They were instructional materials that taught proper behavior, historical precedents, and theological concepts to largely illiterate populations. The funeral practices reveal a society obsessed with continuity between this world and whatever came next. Elite burials contained everything needed for eternal comfort. Servants, weapons, pottery, jewelry, food, and sometimes entire workshops of tools for continuing professional activities in the afterlife. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were practical preparations for a journey that required material as well as spiritual resources. But the most fascinating aspect of Moche culture was their approach to time and history. They didn't see themselves as living in isolation, but as part of a continuous story that connected past, present, and future generations. Every significant event was recorded in pottery, textiles, and architectural decoration that served as cultural memory banks. Their art wasn't just aesthetic expression, it was historical documentation that preserved community knowledge across centuries. The ceramic narratives depicted everything from daily life to cosmic mythology with documentary precision. Hunting scenes showed specific animals in accurate ecological contexts. Political ceremonies portrayed actual individuals wearing authentic regalia. Even the supernatural beings followed consistent iconographic rules that allowed future generations to understand their symbolic meanings. This cultural continuity was maintained through educational systems that would be recognizable today. Children learned through apprenticeships that combined practical skills with cultural transmission. Master craftsmen weren't just teaching techniques, they were preserving civilizational knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. The workshops were libraries, schools, and research centers disguised as pottery studios and textile factories. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Moche architecture and art demonstrates sophisticated scientific understanding. They tracked solar and lunar cycles with precision that allowed accurate agricultural planning. Their ceremonial calendar synchronized with celestial events that marked seasonal transitions. The orientation of major buildings followed astronomical alignments that connected earthly activities with cosmic rhythms. But they weren't just passive observers of natural cycles. Moche engineers modified their environment on a scale that rivaled modern public works projects. They diverted rivers, drained swamps, created artificial harbors, and built road systems that connected mountain valleys with coastal plains across hundreds of miles of challenging terrain. This wasn't just impressive engineering. It was landscape, scale art that treated the entire geographical region as a collaborative masterpiece. The environmental challenges they faced would discourage modern planners. El Nido weather patterns periodically devastated their agricultural systems with floods that destroyed irrigation infrastructure and changed river courses. Earthquakes regularly damaged their carefully constructed buildings. Droughts lasted for years, forcing communities to survive on stored resources and emergency crops. Yet they not only survived, but thrived for over 6 centuries, adapting their civilization to work with rather than against natural forces. Their response to environmental crisis was characteristically practical and spiritual. Flood control wasn't just engineering, it was religious obligation that required community cooperation on a massive scale. Drought management involved both practical water conservation and ceremonial appeals to supernatural forces that controlled rainfall. They understood that human survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with natural and spiritual powers simultaneously. The medical knowledge preserved in Moche art suggests sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and disease treatment. Pottery depicts surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and therapeutic practices that demonstrate empirical medical tradition. Healers weren't just spiritual advisors, they were practical physicians who combined herbal knowledge with surgical skills and psychological counseling. Their approach to mental health was particularly advanced. They recognized that psychological distress could manifest in physical symptoms and treated emotional problems with combination therapies that addressed spiritual, social, and biological factors simultaneously. Community healing ceremonies provided social support while individual treatments addressed specific medical needs. The legal system that governed Moche society was based on principles that balanced individual rights with community obligations. Justice wasn't just punishment, it was social restoration that repaired relationships damaged by criminal behavior. Courts considered not only immediate facts but also social context, family history, and community impact when determining appropriate responses to legal disputes. Property rights were complex systems that recognized individual ownership within community obligations. Land belonged to families, but was managed according to collective water rights and agricultural schedules. Craft specializations created intellectual property concepts that protected trade secrets while ensuring knowledge transmission to qualified apprentices. Marriage customs reflected the practical requirements of desert survival and social organization. Unions weren't just romantic partnerships. They were economic alliances that combined resources, shared labor responsibilities, and created kinship networks that provided security across generations. Courtship involved families negotiating agreements that balanced personal preferences with community needs. Child rearing practices prepared young people for adult responsibilities that went far beyond simple job training. Education included practical skills, cultural knowledge, religious obligations, and social protocols that enabled participation in complex community activities. Children weren't just future adults. They were cultural inheritors responsible for maintaining civilizational continuity. The games and recreational activities preserved in Moche art reveal a society that understood the importance of leisure and entertainment. Sports weren't just physical exercise, they were community events that reinforced social bonds and provided opportunities for peaceful competition. Music and dance were integral parts of daily life, not special occasion entertainment. Food preparation was elevated to artistic levels that transformed nutrition into aesthetic experience. Cooking wasn't just sustenance, it was cultural expression that demonstrated regional identity, seasonal awareness, and social status. Feast preparation required community cooperation that strengthened social bonds while celebrating shared prosperity. The trading relationships that sustained Moche prosperity were built on trust networks that spanned vast geographical distances. Merchants weren't just commercial agents. They were cultural ambassadors who carried information, artistic influences, and technological innovations along with their material goods. Trade routes were communication systems that connected isolated communities with larger cultural movements. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Moche civilization was their integration of practical and spiritual concerns into a coherent worldview that provided both material prosperity and psychological security. They didn't separate religious belief from daily activities. They understood that survival in their harsh environment required both technical competence and spiritual wisdom. Their ceremonies weren't escapes from reality. They were community activities that reinforced the social cooperation necessary for desert survival. Religious festivals provided opportunities for trade, mate selection, and information exchange and collective decision making while maintaining cultural traditions that preserved accumulated wisdom. The artistic achievements that made Moche culture famous weren't luxury productions created for elite consumption. They were community resources that served practical functions while providing aesthetic pleasure. Beautiful objects weren't just decorative. They were educational materials, historical records, and spiritual tools that enhanced daily life for everyone. The architectural monuments that dominated their landscape weren't just religious buildings. They were community investments that provided employment, demonstrated collective capabilities, and created focal points for social organization. Building pyramids wasn't just spiritual obligation, it was practical infrastructure development that supported complex urban populations. The agricultural innovations that sustained their civilization weren't just technical achievements. They were collaborative projects that required community cooperation across generations. Irrigation systems weren't just engineering. They were social contracts that balanced individual needs with collective survival requirements. The military organizations that protected their prosperity weren't just professional armies. They were community defense systems that integrated security concerns with social development. Warriors weren't just fighters. They were community leaders who understood that victory required both combat skills and political wisdom. The trading networks that connected them with distant regions weren't just commercial relationships. They were cultural exchanges that enriched their civilization with new ideas, technologies, and artistic influences. Merchants weren't just business people. They were cultural innovators who brought external knowledge into local contexts. The educational systems that preserved their knowledge weren't just professional training. They were cultural transmission mechanisms that adapted ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges. Teachers weren't just instructors. They were cultural guardians who balanced tradition with innovation. The legal institutions that governed their society weren't just rule enforcement. They were conflict resolution systems that maintained social harmony while protecting individual rights. Judges weren't just arbitrators. They were community leaders who understood that justice required both fairness and wisdom. The medical practices that maintained their health weren't just disease treatment. They were holistic wellness systems that addressed physical, psychological, and spiritual needs simultaneously. Healers weren't just physicians. They were community counselors who understood that individual health required social as well as biological intervention. The family structures that organized their society weren't just kinship networks. They were economic partnerships that shared resources, divided labor, and provided security across generations. Parents weren't just biological reproducers. They were cultural educators who prepared children for adult responsibilities. The recreational activities that enriched their leisure time weren't just entertainment. They were community bonding experiences that reinforced social relationships while providing individual pleasure. Games weren't just fun. They were educational activities that taught cooperation, competition, and strategic thinking. The food production systems that sustained their populations weren't just agriculture. They were ecological management practices that worked with rather than against natural systems. Farmers weren't just crop producers. They were environmental stewards who understood that long-term survival required sustainable resource use. And through it all, woven into every aspect of their civilization, like threads in their magnificent textiles, were the religious practices that connected individual lives with cosmic purposes. These weren't separate from daily activities. They were the spiritual dimension of practical life that provided meaning, motivation, and moral guidance for a people who understood that survival in a difficult world required both human cooperation and divine support. The Moche created a civilization that balanced individual achievement with community welfare, practical innovation with spiritual wisdom, local identity with international connections, and present prosperity with future sustainability. They proved that human societies could thrive in challenging environments through intelligent cooperation, adaptive creativity, and the understanding that true wealth comes not from material accumulation, but from cultural achievement that enriches life for everyone. Their legacy isn't just the beautiful pottery and impressive architecture that fills museums around the world. It's the demonstration that human beings can create societies that honor both individual potential and collective needs, that integrate spiritual meaning with practical success, and that transform hostile environments into prosperous communities through cooperative intelligence and shared commitment to civilizational values. In our modern world, facing our own environmental challenges and social complexities, the Moche example offers hope that human creativity and cooperation can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. They remind us that civilization isn't just about technological advancement. It's about creating communities that provide both material prosperity and spiritual fulfillment for all their members. The desert kingdom they built lasted for 6 centuries, longer than most modern nations have existed. When it finally ended, it wasn't destroyed by external conquest or internal collapse, but transformed by climate changes that required their descendants to adapt their cultural traditions to new environmental conditions. Even their ending was a testament to human resilience and adaptive creativity. Today, as we face our own challenges of climate change, social inequality, and cultural fragmentation, we might look to the Moche for inspiration. They showed us that it's possible to create prosperous, stable, culturally rich civilizations that honor both human needs and environmental limits. They demonstrated that true wealth comes not from exploiting resources, but from developing human potential through cooperative achievement. Their pottery still speaks to us across 15 centuries, their architecture still inspires awe, and their example still offers hope that human beings can create societies worthy of their highest aspirations. In a world that often seems divided between practical necessity and spiritual meaning, the Moche showed us that the two can be integrated into a way of life that serves both material and transcendent human needs. That's their real gift to us. The knowledge that civilization doesn't have to choose between prosperity and meaning, between individual achievement and community welfare, between local identity and universal values. The Moche proved that human societies can have it all if we're willing to work together with the intelligence, creativity, and commitment that they brought to their extraordinary desert kingdom. And perhaps most importantly, they showed us that even the most challenging environments can become homes for human flourishing if we approach them with the right combination of practical wisdom, spiritual understanding, and collaborative determination. In their desert kingdom, they created not just survival, but genuine civilization that honored the full range of human potential and possibility. The Moche didn't just live in their harsh environment, they transformed it into a garden that supported not just biological life, but the full flowering of human cultural achievement. That transformation wasn't accomplished by a few exceptional leaders, but by entire communities working together over many generations to create something greater than any individual could achieve alone. Their story is ultimately our story. The human story of cooperation, creativity, and the endless possibility of turning challenges into opportunities for growth and achievement. In their desert kingdom, they prove that there are no limits to what human beings can accomplish when they work together with wisdom, skill, and shared commitment to creating something beautiful and lasting. The pyramids still stand. The pottery still amazes. The irrigation channels, though abandoned, still mark the landscape like ancient promises that human intelligence and cooperation can make the desert bloom. And the memory of their achievement still inspires us to believe that we, too, can create civilizations worthy of our highest human aspirations. But let's get back to the gritty details of what it actually meant to live in this desert paradise, because the daily reality was far more complex and fascinating than any museum display could capture. Your average Moche citizen didn't wake up thinking about their civilization's lasting impact on world history. They woke up thinking about whether the irrigation channel would deliver water on schedule, and whether their neighbour's rooster would shut up long enough for them to get back to sleep. The social dynamics that kept Moche society functioning were as intricate as their pottery designs and twice as fragile. Take the institution of reciprocal labour, called Aini by their Andean descendants, which was basically a community-wide system of IOUs that would make a modern accountant weep with confusion. You helped your neighbour build his house, he helped you harvest your crops, she helped you weave textiles for your daughter's wedding, and everyone kept track of who owed what to whom in a mental ledger system that required the mathematical skills of a tax attorney and the memory of an elephant. This wasn't just neighbourly cooperation, it was the economic foundation that made their civilization possible. When the time came to build those massive pyramids, they didn't rely on slave labour or imperial conscription. They activated the Aini network on a scale that would make modern community organisers jealous. Thousands of people contributed labour, materials, and expertise not because they were forced to, but because they were part of a reciprocal obligation system that had been building social credit for generations. The logistics of organising this voluntary labour force were mind-boggling. Someone had to coordinate the schedules of farmers who could only work during agricultural off-seasons, artisans who needed to complete their own projects first, and specialists whose skills were required in specific sequences. They needed to provide food, tools, and housing for thousands of workers, organise transportation for materials from distant sources, and maintain quality control standards that would ensure the monuments lasted for centuries. All of this was managed without written records, at least not written records as we understand them. The Moche had a sophisticated system of record, keeping using knotted strings called quipu, but most administrative details were maintained through oral tradition and collective memory. The foremen who supervised pyramid construction carried the architectural plans in their heads, passed down through apprenticeships that lasted decades and included not just technical knowledge, but the social protocols necessary to manage large groups of volunteers. The religious calendar that governed these construction projects was synchronized with agricultural cycles in ways that balanced spiritual obligations with practical necessities. Major building phases were scheduled during periods when farm work was minimal, but they also had to account for seasonal availability of materials, weather patterns that affected transportation, and the complex scheduling requirements of specialists whose services were in constant demand. The feast days that punctuated these construction projects weren't just religious observances. They were massive catering operations that fed thousands of people while maintaining the social bonds that kept the volunteer labour system functioning. Organising these feasts required its own network of specialist farmers who produced surplus food, potters who created serving vessels, textile workers who provided decorations, musicians who provided entertainment, and administrators who coordinated the entire operation. The scale of food preparation for these events would challenge modern event planners. They were cooking for populations equivalent to small cities, using ingredients that had to be gathered from diverse ecological zones, prepared using traditional techniques that required extensive advanced planning, and served in quantities that required mathematical precision to avoid either waste or shortages. The cooking vessels alone represented a major industrial effort. Large-scale food preparation required enormous ceramic pots that were themselves engineering achievements, designed to distribute heat evenly, withstand thermal stress, and be transported when full without breaking. The potters who created these utilitarian masterpieces were as skilled as their colleagues who made the artistic ceramics that fill museum collections today. The social hierarchies that governed these communal activities were complex enough to require their own diplomatic protocols. High-status individuals contributed different types of labour than commoners, but everyone was expected to participate in ways appropriate to their social position. Elite women might supervise textile production rather than actually weaving, but they were still part of the production process, and their reputations depended on the quality of work produced under their supervision. The children who grew up in this environment received an education that would be impossible to duplicate in modern schools. They learned practical skills by participating in real community projects, absorbed cultural values through daily interaction with extended family networks, and developed social competencies through constant exposure to complex group dynamics that required cooperation, negotiation, and mutual support. Their play activities were miniature versions of adult responsibilities that prepared them for future roles while providing genuine childhood enjoyment. Children played with ceramic toys that taught them about animal behavior, practiced weaving on child-sized looms that produced actual useful textiles, and participated in mock ceremonies that introduced them to religious concepts and social protocols they would need as adults. The gender roles that organized Moche society were more flexible than many ancient civilizations, but they were still clearly defined and carried serious social consequences for those who violated expectations. Women could achieve high status through textile production, religious service, or administrative skills, but they were generally excluded from military leadership and certain types of craft specialization that were considered masculine domains. Men were expected to demonstrate physical courage and technical competence, but they were also required to show social intelligence and cooperative skills that enabled effective participation in community projects. The ideal Moche man wasn't just a warrior or craftsman, he was a community leader who could balance individual achievement with collective responsibilities. The marriage customs that governed family formation were elaborate negotiations that involved not just the couple, but their extended families, social networks, and economic partnerships. Courtship wasn't just romantic, it was a complex evaluation process that assessed compatibility, resource potential, social connections, and cultural knowledge that would enable successful family formation. Wedding ceremonies were community investments that demonstrated the collective commitment to supporting new families. The gifts, labor contributions, and social recognition that accompanied marriages weren't just celebration. They were practical support systems that provided new couples with the resources necessary to establish independent households and contribute to community prosperity. The divorce procedures that ended unsuccessful marriages were as complex as the marriage processes that created them, requiring community mediation that balanced individual needs with collective stability. Failed marriages weren't just personal disappointments, they were social disruptions that required careful management to prevent broader community conflicts. The inheritance systems that transferred property and social position across generations were sophisticated legal frameworks that balanced individual rights with family obligations and community needs. Wealth wasn't just passed from parents to children, it was redistributed through complex networks that maintained social stability while rewarding achievement and maintaining incentives for productive behavior. The dispute resolution mechanisms that maintained social harmony were based on restorative rather than punitive justice principles. When conflicts arose, the goal wasn't to punish wrongdoers, but to repair damaged relationships and restore community equilibrium. This required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that enabled effective mediation and conflict prevention. The healthcare system that maintained community health was based on holistic approaches that addressed physical, psychological, and social factors simultaneously. Illness wasn't just biological dysfunction, it was social disruption that required community response as well as individual treatment. Healers were community leaders who understood that individual health problems often reflected broader social stresses that needed collective attention. The educational institutions that transmitted cultural knowledge were integrated into daily life rather than separated into specialized schools. Learning happened through participation in community activities, observation of skilled practitioners, and gradual assumption of increasing responsibilities that provided practical experience while maintaining cultural continuity. The entertainment industry that provided recreation and cultural enrichment was woven into religious and social activities rather than existing as separate commercial enterprises. Musicians, storytellers, and performers were community members whose artistic activities served social functions while providing individual creative expression and collective enjoyment. The information networks that connected Moche communities with each other and with distant civilizations were maintained through trade relationships, religious pilgrimages, and diplomatic exchanges that carried news, ideas, and innovations along with material goods. Communication wasn't just practical necessity, it was cultural enrichment that prevented isolation and maintained connection with broader human developments. The environmental management practices that sustained their desert civilization were based on sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships that enabled long-term sustainability. They didn't just exploit natural resources, they managed ecosystem processes in ways that maintained productivity while supporting human communities. Their agricultural techniques actually improved soil fertility over time rather than depleting it. The technological innovations that supported their prosperity were developed through collaborative research and development processes that combined individual creativity with collective knowledge. Innovations weren't just individual achievements, they were community assets that were shared, improved, and adapted to local conditions through networks of practitioners who understood that technological progress required cooperative effort. The artistic traditions that made their civilization famous were integrated into daily life rather than confined to elite consumption. Beautiful objects weren't just luxury items, they were community resources that enhanced daily experience while serving practical functions. Aesthetic appreciation wasn't separate from practical utility, it was an integrated approach to life that understood beauty as a necessity rather than a luxury. The architectural achievements that dominated their landscape were community projects that demonstrated collective capabilities while serving practical functions. Buildings weren't just impressive monuments, they were functional infrastructure that supported complex urban populations while providing focal points for social organization and cultural identity. The military traditions that protected their prosperity were based on community defense concepts that integrated security concerns with social development. Warfare wasn't just professional violence, it was community protection that required broad social support and careful management to prevent disruption of civilian life and economic activities. And through all of these complex systems and sophisticated achievements ran the thread of individual human experience that connected personal dreams and fears with collective aspirations and achievements. Every Moche citizen was simultaneously a unique individual and a community member whose personal success depended on collective prosperity and whose individual contributions enhanced shared welfare. This integration of individual and community interests wasn't just social philosophy, it was practical necessity in an environment where survival required cooperation and prosperity demanded collective effort. The Moche understood that true wealth came not from individual accumulation, but from community development that created opportunities for everyone to achieve their potential while contributing to shared success. Their civilization lasted for over 6 centuries because they solved the fundamental challenge that faces all human societies: how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how to encourage personal achievement while maintaining social harmony, and how to create prosperity that serves human needs while respecting environmental limits. The memory of their achievement continues to inspire us today because they proved that human beings can create societies that honor both practical needs and transcendent values, that serve both material prosperity and spiritual fulfillment, and that demonstrate the infinite potential of human cooperation and creativity applied to the challenges and opportunities of existence on this remarkable planet we all share.